At our anniversary party, my husband stood in front of our closest friends and family and called me a burden like I didn't belong in my own life. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if humiliating me was just another part of the evening. I remember the way the glasses stopped clinking, the way conversations faded mid-sentence, and how every eye in the room slowly turned toward me, waiting for me to react. But I didn't. I just stood there, holding my drink, as if his words had not reached me at all. What no one understood in that moment was that silence was not weakness, it was control. And control is something I've been trained in for years. If this story speaks to your heart, take a second to like and subscribe, and only if it truly resonates with you. Leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now, because I want to know where this moment is being heard in the world. My name is Emily Carter. I am 39 years old, and what happened that night at our anniversary party was the moment everything I built, everything I protected, and everything I hid finally collided in front of the people I never wanted to see it. But to understand how it reached that point, you have to go back to where it all quietly began, when everything still looked normal from the outside, even though it was already breaking on the inside. The party was held in a private estate, just outside of Austin, Texas, a place my husband Daniel insisted on renting, for what he called a perfect celebration of our marriage. There were about 50 guests, most of them his business associates and family members, people who had always seen me as just his wife, nothing more. I stood near the edge of the dining area, watching him move through the crowd with confidence, laughing easily, shaking hands, performing like he owned the room. That was Daniel's strength, controlling how people saw him, how they felt about him, how they believed his version of reality. When he finally tapped his glass and called for attention, I already knew something about the night had shifted. He looked at me when he spoke, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment framed as honesty. He said I had become a burden to his life, that I didn't contribute in the way someone in his position needed, that I was simply there, occupying space that could have been used for something more valuable. A few people shifted uncomfortably, others avoided my eyes, and a few even laughed quietly, as if they were being let in on a joke I was not part of. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my expression steady, because reacting would have given him exactly what he wanted. Instead, I set my glass down slowly and looked at him as if I was listening to something distant and unimportant. No one in that room knew that I had spent years in environments where pressure like this was normal, where decisions were made in silence, not speeches. No one knew that I had learned how to stay still when everything around me was trying to make me move. Daniel thought he had reduced me to nothing in front of everyone that night, but what he didn't see was the message I had already sent just minutes before, one simple confirmation that would change the entire direction of the evening. And as the music continued and the laughter slowly returned like nothing had happened, I realized this moment was not the beginning of my breaking point. It was the beginning of his misunderstanding, and everything that followed would come from what he believed he had already won. The room had already started pretending nothing happened, but I could feel the tension still hanging in the air like something unfinished, something no one wanted to name. Daniel continued talking to his guests as if he had simply made a casual remark earlier, laughing again, clinking glasses, returning to the version of himself that people were comfortable with. That was always his strength, resetting reality in front of others, rewriting the tone of a moment so quickly that people began to doubt what they had just witnessed. I stayed in the same place near the edge of the room, not because I was frozen, but because I was observing. Years of training had taught me that the loudest moments are never the most important ones. It is the silence that follows that tells you what is coming next. Daniel had no idea that I was not reacting because I was already listening for something else, something only I could recognize. A small vibration in my pocket confirmed that the message I had sent earlier had been received, a simple confirmation that changed nothing on the surface but everything underneath it. I did not check it, I did not need to, because I already knew what it meant. Daniel walked past me at one point, lowering his voice just enough so only I could hear him, telling me that I should be grateful for the life I had, that I was lucky to be included in something as successful as his world. He said it like a reminder, not an insult, like he was correcting my understanding of reality. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he still believed his version of things was the only one that mattered. Around us, guests began to relax again, conversations rising back to normal volume. the earlier moment slowly dissolving into background noise as people convinced themselves it was not important enough to remember. That was when I noticed the subtle change outside through the tall glass doors of the estate, a shift in light that did not belong to the party, a stillness that did not match the music inside. A few guests glanced toward the entrance, then looked away again, unsure if they were imagining it. Daniel did not notice at first, because he was too focused on maintaining control of the room he believed he owned. I did not move. I simply waited, because I knew that what was coming next did not require my participation to arrive. The first knock at the door was soft, almost polite, but it carried a weight that did not belong to a guest arriving late. Then came another sound, clearer this time, organized footsteps approaching the entrance in perfect rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant. The conversations inside the room began to slow without anyone realizing why, voices lowering as attention naturally shifted toward the doors. Daniel finally turned his head, irritated at the interruption, as if the night itself had disrespected his timing. When the doors finally opened, there was no announcement from the staff, no introduction, only a presence that filled the entryway immediately. A group of uniformed military personnel stepped inside with calm precision, their presence changing the atmosphere faster than any words could. The room went quiet in a way that felt absolute, like sound itself had been switched off. The officer at the front scanned the room once, then locked eyes directly on me. In a clear, steady voice that carried across the entire estate, he said my name followed by my rank, calling me Captain Carter as if it was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, no one reacted, because no one understood what they were hearing. And in that exact moment, I saw Daniel's expression change for the first time that night, not with anger, not with confusion, but with the slow realization that something he had dismissed was suddenly far beyond his control. For a moment, the entire room stayed suspended in silence, as if no one trusted their own ears. The words that had just been spoken did not belong to the world Daniel had carefully built for that evening, and I could see people struggling to reconcile what they were hearing with what they believed they knew about me. Daniel stood completely still, his hand halfway raised as if he had intended to speak but forgot how. The officer who had entered did not repeat himself, did not explain. He simply maintained his position with calm authority, waiting as though the room itself needed time to catch up. I finally turned slightly toward him, not with surprise, but with acknowledgement, and gave a small nod that confirmed everything. That single gesture changed the temperature of the entire space. I could feel it immediately, the shift from confusion to recognition among the military personnel standing behind him. One of them stepped forward and opened a secure folder, confirming details in a low voice that only the officers could understand. But even without hearing the content, the presence of procedure was enough to make people uneasy. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice no longer confident, asking what was happening and why military personnel were in our home. The officer turned his attention briefly toward him, not aggressively, but with the kind of calm that did not invite interruption. He stated clearly that they were there under direct operational protocol to report to me. The word report landed heavier than anything else that night, because it implied structure, authority, and recognition that did not belong to the version of me Daniel had been describing just minutes earlier. I noticed his family shifting uncomfortably, exchanging glances as if trying to find a mistake in the situation, something they could dismiss as misunderstanding, but there was none. The officers were not uncertain, they were precise, and precision in a moment like this leaves no space for interpretation. Daniel took a step closer to me, lowering his voice, asking me what I had done, as if my silence earlier was now beginning to make sense in a way he did not like. I looked at him calmly and told him that I had done nothing outside of my duty, and that he had simply never asked the right questions. That answer did not satisfy him, because it did not give him control back. Around us, the guests began to realize that the situation was no longer social, it had become official, though no one yet understood in what way. The officer then confirmed my rank again, this time more formally, identifying me as Captain Emily Carter, assigned to active command within a unit he named directly, a detail that caused several people in the room to go completely still. I saw one of Daniel's business partners quietly step back, as if distance could protect him from being associated with what was unfolding. Daniel's confidence, which had filled the room earlier, was now collapsing in visible stages, replaced by something closer to disbelief. He looked at me as if he was trying to locate the version of me he thought he knew, but it was no longer available in the same way. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because the truth was no longer being carried by me alone. It was being confirmed by every uniform in that room. And as the reality settled in, I realized that what had begun as a private moment of humiliation had now transformed into something far larger, something that could not be contained by assumptions or reputation, and the night was no longer about what had been said earlier, it was now about what would be understood next. The moment the officer confirmed my rank again, something inside the room shifted from confusion into undeniable acceptance, because repetition in a calm, authoritative voice removes any remaining room for doubt. I could feel it in the way people stopped whispering, in the way chairs no longer moved, in the way even the air seemed heavier as everyone tried to process what they were witnessing. Daniel was still looking at me, but now it was no longer the same kind of look. It was not dominance or irritation anymore. It was calculation breaking down in real time. He asked me again, this time slower, what exactly this meant, as if repeating the question could somehow change the answer. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I turned slightly toward the officer and gave a subtle gesture that only someone familiar with procedure would recognize. That small motion triggered a coordinated response from the unit behind him. One of them stepped forward and began placing formal documentation on a nearby table, each folder marked with classification headers and official seals that immediately drew attention from the guests closest to it. The guests who saw it first instinctively stepped back, not because they were told to, but because certain symbols of authority create distance on their own. Daniel noticed the movement and finally followed their gaze. His expression tightened as he saw the documents, and for the first time that night, he stopped trying to speak over the situation and started trying to understand it. One of his business associates leaned slightly toward him, whispering something I could not hear, but the tone was enough to signal uncertainty, replacing confidence. The officer then clarified in a steady voice that my presence here was not social, it was official, and that my role extended beyond what any of them had assumed. He did not elaborate unnecessarily, which made every word feel more significant. I watched Daniel's posture change again, his shoulders lowering slightly as if the weight of interpretation had suddenly become too heavy to hold upright. He asked me quietly, almost carefully now, why I never told him. That question carried a different energy, no longer accusation, but fear of missing something important. I looked at him and told him that some roles do not need to be announced in order to exist, they only need to be observed correctly. Around us, the room had completely transformed into something closer to an evaluation than a celebration. People were no longer reacting emotionally, they were trying to understand hierarchy, proximity, and consequence. The officer confirmed that my unit had been dispatched under direct protocol authorization and that their arrival was scheduled based on a confirmation request I had submitted earlier that evening. That detail landed differently, because it meant nothing here was accidental. Daniel stepped back slightly, placing a hand on the edge of the table, as if needing physical support to process what he was hearing. The confidence that had filled him earlier was no longer visible, replaced by something far more unstable, the realization that control had shifted outside of his influence. I remained still, not because I was waiting for approval, but because the situation no longer required my participation to progress. The unit stood in disciplined formation behind the officer, not interacting, not reacting, simply present as confirmation that everything being stated was real. One of the guests finally asked, almost in disbelief, what my rank meant in practical terms, and before I could answer, the officer stated clearly that it placed me in command authority within my assigned operational structure. That sentence settled across the room like a final weight, because authority is only questioned until it is defined, and once defined, it becomes difficult to ignore. Daniel looked at me again, but this time there was no performance left in him, only the beginning of understanding that the story he had told about me no longer matched reality. And as the silence stretched across the anniversary party, I realized that what had begun as his attempt to define me had now turned into the moment where I no longer needed definition at all. The silence inside the room was no longer the kind of silence that followed shock. It had become a structured silence, the kind that appears when people realize they are no longer participants in a situation, but observers of something they cannot influence. I could feel eyes moving between me, the officer, and Daniel, as if everyone was silently trying to rebuild the narrative in their minds using the new information. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was no longer steady. It carried hesitation now, something I had never heard from him in front of others. He asked me what I had been doing all this time without telling him, as if the absence of information was itself a form of betrayal. I looked at him for a moment before answering, because the truth was not complicated, but it was never something he had been prepared to understand. I told him I had been doing my duty, the same way I always had, just not in a way that fit into the version of life he chose to believe we were living. That answer did not satisfy him, but it was never meant to. Around us, the officers maintained their positions, calm and unmoving, reinforcing the reality that this moment did not belong to personal interpretation anymore. One of the senior officers stepped forward and began speaking in a more formal tone, confirming that my role within the unit had remained active and classified under operational discretion, which explained why my identity had never been part of our shared personal life. That phrase, operational discretion, changed the way several guests reacted, because it implied structure beyond anything they had assumed. Daniel turned slightly away from me, looking toward his father, who until now had remained unusually silent. His father's expression was no longer confident. It was controlled, but not in the way it had been earlier in the evening. It was the expression of someone recalculating risk. The officer then confirmed that the unit's presence tonight was not symbolic. It was procedural, tied to a confirmation request that had been submitted and approved through proper channels. Hearing that, I noticed how quickly the room stopped treating this as an interruption and started treating it as a formal event with consequences. Daniel stepped closer to me again, but slower this time, as if testing whether the space between us still belonged to him. He asked quietly if everything I had built in my life outside of him had always been separate from what he knew. I did not answer immediately, because the truth was not about separation, it was about containment. I told him that not everything visible is shared, and not everything shared is visible. That was the moment I saw it clearly in his face, the realization that he had been evaluating my entire existence through a limited frame. The officer then gave a final acknowledgement to the unit, confirming that their arrival objectives had been fulfilled and that protocol visibility had been established for all required witnesses present. That phrase made it clear that this moment was not just personal, it was now officially recorded within a system none of the guests had access to. I could see some of Daniel's guests beginning to shift uncomfortably, understanding that they were no longer just attendees at a private celebration, but witnesses to something with formal weight. Daniel looked at me again, but this time there was no authority in his expression, only uncertainty trying to form into understanding. The confidence he had used earlier in the evening to define me had completely dissolved, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that he had been speaking about a version of me that had never been complete. And as the officer stepped back into formation, the room no longer felt like it belonged to him or to anyone trying to control it. It felt like it belonged to the truth that had finally been acknowledged out loud. The night did not end with noise or argument, but with a strange kind of stillness that felt heavier than anything that had happened before it. After the officers completed their formal confirmation and stepped back into formation, no one in the room seemed to know how to continue being the same person they were an hour earlier. Conversations did not resume properly, laughter did not return, and even the music in the background felt distant, almost irrelevant. Daniel stood near the table without speaking, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty that made him look smaller in a way I had never seen before. I did not approach him, and I did not need to. There was nothing left to explain that the room had not already understood in its own way. Slowly, the guests began to leave, one by one, without ceremony, without comments, just polite nods that carried the weight of discomfort and realization. When the last of them finally stepped out into the cool night air outside the estate in Austin, Texas, I remained standing in the same place where everything had shifted. Daniel's father tried to speak to me at one point, but stopped halfway through his sentence, as if realizing that nothing he could say would return the evening to what it once was. The officers departed shortly after, as quietly and precisely as they had arrived, leaving behind only the echo of structure in a space that had been built on assumptions. When the door finally closed, it was just Daniel and me left in a house that no longer felt like it belonged to either of us in the same way. He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for something familiar, but I could see he was no longer sure what he was looking at. There was no anger in his expression anymore, only exhaustion, and the slow recognition that some truths do not arrive to argue, they arrive to clarify. I finally broke the silence by telling him that I never needed him to understand my identity in order for it to exist, and I never needed his approval to define my worth. He did not respond immediately, and when he did, it was not with defense, but with something closer to regret that had no clear place to go. I left the room before it could become a conversation that tried to fix what had already been exposed too clearly. In the days that followed, life did not become dramatic or cinematic. It became quieter. I returned to my duties, to structure, to the kind of clarity that does not depend on how others see me. The marriage did not continue in the same form, because some moments do not destroy love. They reveal that it was never balanced in the first place. I learned that respect cannot survive where perception is stronger than truth, and that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is preparation. If there is one thing this experience left me with, it is the understanding that people will define you as long as you allow their version of you to go unchallenged, and that your identity cannot depend on being recognized by those who benefit from misunderstanding it. For anyone listening who feels unseen, underestimated, or quietly diminished by the people closest to them, I want you to know something simple and real. You are not required to shrink yourself to remain accepted, and you are not required to explain your worth to those who are committed to not seeing it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay steady, stay honest, and let time reveal what words cannot. And when you feel overwhelmed, when doubt feels louder than clarity, trust that small inner voice that tells you something is not right, because intuition is often the first form of truth we are given before reality catches up. I am not telling you this from a place of perfection, but from experience, from learning, from standing in moments where silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. If this story reached you in any way, I hope you will take a moment to breathe, to reflect, and to remember that your value is not assigned by others. It is recognized within you long before the world agrees. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way through, for sharing this space of reflection. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or subscribe, and know that wherever you are in the world, you are not alone in what you are carrying. My name is Emily Carter. I am 39 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Your truth does not become real when others accept it. It becomes real the moment you stop abandoning it.